Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully unpleasant. So, dim the lights a little. Get comfortable. Put your phone somewhere that requires just enough effort to reach that you probably won't bother. Let the room get quiet. And tonight, we're going to travel back to medieval Europe. Not to the castle, not to the banquet hall, not to the polished chamber, where some nobleman is complaining that his imported wine is slightly too warm. No, tonight, we're going somewhere much less glamorous. We're going to the little village, to the muddy lane, to the crooked wooden house, to the field that seems to go on forever. And most importantly, we're going to meet the medieval peasant who has absolutely no idea why anyone would describe his life as the good old days. Because, honestly, it wasn't for most ordinary people in medieval Europe. Life was a long sequence of small problems. The sort of problems that never quite became dramatic enough to deserve a song, but were always there waiting for you. Your roof leaked. Your shoes were falling apart. The harvest wasn't looking fantastic. Your cow had developed an attitude. Someone owed you money. You owed someone else grain. And there was always something that needed fixing. So settle in. Let your shoulders relax. And imagine that it's somewhere around the 11th or 12th century. The exact year doesn't matter too much. The sun hasn't risen yet, and you are already awake. Not because you're particularly energetic. Not because you have a morning routine involving meditation and a glass of lemon water. You are awake because your bed is terrible. Your bed, if we can generously call it that, is probably made from a wooden frame, straw, and perhaps an old blanket or rough cloth. The straw is flattened in some places and gathered into unpleasant little lumps in others. So, naturally, you spend the entire night slowly sliding toward the same uncomfortable patch. You shift your body. The straw crackles. Someone nearby coughs. A child rolls over. The fire in the hearth has mostly died down, and for a moment, the house is quiet. This is probably the nicest moment of your day. Unfortunately, it lasts about 12 seconds, because somewhere outside, a rooster has decided that everyone needs to know about the sunrise. The rooster is not concerned about your sleep schedule. The rooster has no respect for boundaries. And so, before the sky is even properly brightened, the village begins to stir. Your wife is already awake. Perhaps she has been awake for some time. There is bread to prepare, water to collect, children to get moving, clothing to repair, food to stretch, and a long list of other tasks that somehow reproduce when nobody is looking. Medieval households did not have weekends in the modern sense. There was no magical Saturday morning when everyone could sleep until 10. There were religious feast days and occasional holidays, of course, but ordinary work remained a constant part of life. And this is one of the first things that makes medieval peasant life difficult to imagine from a modern perspective. Today, we tend to divide life into categories: work, home, school, free time, vacation. For a medieval peasant, those boundaries were much blurrier. Your home was also your workplace. Your animals were part of your household. Your food often depended directly on your labor. And if something went wrong, there wasn't a customer service number to call. There was just you, and possibly your neighbor, if he happened to know what he was doing. So you slowly sit up. Your feet touch the floor. The floor is cold, very cold, the sort of cold that makes you briefly reconsider every decision that led you to become conscious. You pull on your clothes. There is no wardrobe full of carefully chosen outfits. Most people own relatively few garments. Clothing is valuable because making it takes time. Wool has to come from sheep. Flax has to be processed. Fibers have to be spun. Thread has to be woven. Cloth has to be cut and sewn. And none of this is happening inside a giant factory while you scroll through your phone. It is happening slowly, by hand. So clothes are repaired, and repaired again, and then repaired one more time because apparently that hole is not yet large enough to justify giving up. Your shoes are particularly important, if you have them. Leather footwear wears down. Mud gets everywhere. Fields are full of stones. Roads are terrible, and walking is one of the main ways you get anywhere. A wealthy person can complain about a horse. You complain about your feet. There is a difference. You step outside. The air is cold. The village is beginning to wake. Smoke rises from rooftops. Dogs move around between houses. A few people are already heading toward their animals. The landscape around you is mostly agricultural. Fields dominate the countryside, and your entire existence is tied to what happens in those fields. This is difficult to overstate. For a modern person, a bad harvest might mean expensive groceries. For a medieval peasant, a bad harvest could mean there simply wasn't enough food. There was no supermarket with shelves stretching into the distance. No warehouse full of grain waiting nearby. No refrigerated trucks arriving from another region. The harvest was the great annual calculation. You planted, you worked, you waited, you hoped, and then you harvested. If things went well, you had food. If things went badly, everyone became considerably less cheerful. The medieval agriculture year had its own rhythm: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, processing, and then doing it again. The famous image of the peasant casually wandering through a sunny field is therefore slightly misleading. The field is not a peaceful hobby. It is your livelihood. You need it to work. And today, there is plenty to do. You head toward the fields. Your tools are simple: a wooden-handled implement, perhaps an iron blade, depending on what your community can afford, a hoe, a sickle, a plow. Nothing has an engine. Nothing has a battery. Nothing has a convenient little button that says start. If something breaks, you fix it. If you cannot fix it, you find someone who can. And if nobody can fix it, you have a problem. The medieval peasant was not necessarily poor in the sense of owning absolutely nothing. That is another misconception. Many peasants had homes, tools, animals, clothing, household goods, and access to common resources. But their margin for error was small, very small. You might survive a mediocre harvest. You might survive a sick animal. You might survive a broken tool. But several problems arriving at once could become disastrous. And unfortunately, medieval life was extremely good at sending problems in groups. You work through the morning. The sun rises. The temperature slowly changes. The village becomes louder. People are moving between houses. Animals need feeding. Children are helping where they can. Someone is shouting at a donkey. The donkey, naturally, remains unimpressed. And somewhere nearby, a church bell may mark the passage of time. Religion is woven deeply into medieval society. For most people, Christianity isn't simply a Sunday activity. The calendar itself is shaped by religious festivals, saints' days, fasting periods, and feast days. Your understanding of the world is also different. Disease, weather, birth, death, luck, misfortune, and natural events are interpreted through a worldview that combines practical experience with religious belief, local tradition, and folklore. And yet, despite all the differences, the basic human experience remains strangely familiar. You're hungry. You're tired. You want your children to be safe. You hope the roof doesn't collapse. You like the weather to cooperate. And you probably have at least one neighbor who is irritating. Something survived every century. By midday, you've been working for hours. Your back hurts. Your hands are dirty. Your clothes are dusty. And now comes lunch, which is perhaps the wrong word. There is food, but the medieval peasant diet is heavily dependent on grains. Bread, porridge, pottage, and other grain-based foods are common staples. Vegetables and legumes may appear depending on region and season. Cheese can be important. Eggs can be useful. Meat exists, but for many peasants it isn't an everyday luxury. And this is where medieval food becomes interesting. People did not necessarily spend their lives eating tiny pieces of stale bread and looking sadly at a turnip. The diet could be varied, but it was seasonal, and availability depended heavily on location, wealth, weather, and the success of the harvest. There is also a very important distinction between what people technically could eat and what they could afford to eat regularly. A chicken is not just dinner. A chicken lays eggs. A chicken can reproduce. A chicken can potentially be sold. So eating the chicken may be a little like spending your savings account because you are hungry on Tuesday. Sometimes you do it, but you don't do it casually. You eat your simpler meal, perhaps bread with some pottage, maybe onions, beans, peas, cabbage, or other locally available foods. And you drink something safer, or more practical, then questionable water when possible. Then you return to work. Because the field has not suddenly completed itself. This is perhaps the central feature of peasant life. Work is everywhere, and the work is physical. There's no modern concept of just sitting at your desk for 8 hours. Instead, you bend, lift, carry, dig, walk, cut, repair, feed, clean, repeat, and then, when you think you're finished, there is another task, because the house needs cleaning, the animals need attention, clothing needs repairing, food needs preparing, firewood needs gathering, water needs carrying, and tomorrow will bring more of the same. Let's float over to another small problem. Taxes, or more accurately, obligations. Medieval peasants lived within complicated systems of landholding and authority. Depending on where and when you lived, you might owe rent, labor services, taxes, tithes, or other payments. The exact arrangements varied enormously across medieval Europe. There was no single medieval peasant experience. England was not France. France was not Germany. A village in the 13th century was not identical to one in the 9th, and a free peasant was not the same as a serf. But across many places, ordinary rural people lived under obligations to landlords, churches, communities, and rulers. And this meant that not everything you produced belonged entirely to you. You worked the land. You harvested the grain. But portions of that production could be owed elsewhere, which is a rather effective way of making a person stare thoughtfully at a sack of wheat and wonder where most of it is going. Still, there were also communities. Neighbors mattered. People depended on one another. You might need help repairing a roof. Someone else might need help with a harvest. Tools could be shared. Knowledge was shared. Families lived close together. Life could be harsh, but it wasn't necessarily lonely. In fact, medieval villages could be intensely social. Everyone knew everyone, which sounds charming until you remember that everyone also knew everyone's business. If your cow wandered into someone's field, people knew. If your son was behaving badly, people knew. If your daughter married someone from the next village, people definitely knew. And there was no group chat required. By evening, the workday finally begins to slow. The sun sinks lower. You return home. Your clothes smell of earth and smoke. Your hands are sore. Your body is tired in a way that modern office workers can only achieve after assembling furniture without instructions. The household begins preparing the evening meal. The fire is rebuilt. Food is cooked. Children settle down. Someone tells a story. Someone complains. Someone repairs something. And eventually, the light disappears. There are no electric bulbs. No television. No glowing rectangle sitting beside your bed. Darkness arrives naturally. And with darkness comes another kind of quiet. You lie down again. The straw mattress waits for you. It has not improved during the day. You settle into it anyway. Tomorrow will come early. The rooster will still be there. The fields will still be there. The obligations will still be there. And the medieval peasant will wake up and do it all again. Not because he thinks this is an exciting adventure, but because this is simply life. A life of mud, bread, animals, weather, family, work, faith, and an almost impressive ability to keep going. And as you slowly drift towards sleep, let's leave our peasant there for tonight. The fire is getting low. The village is quiet. The fields are dark. And for a few hours, at least, nobody is asking him to repair anything, which, by medieval standards, is practically a vacation. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow walk through the ordinary life of a medieval peasant. The village is quiet again. The fire has settled into a faint orange glow. And somewhere outside, the first birds are beginning to stir. You have slept, not wonderfully, not terribly, just enough, which, in medieval Europe, is often the closest thing to a luxury. You open your eyes. For a few seconds, you don't move. There is something peaceful about lying still in the darkness. Then you remember the field, and the animals, and the water, and the bread, and the firewood, and approximately 14 other things that apparently need to happen before breakfast. So you get up, because medieval life has very little interest in whether you're feeling motivated. You step outside. The village looks different in the early morning. Without sunlight, the buildings seem smaller. The paths are dark. The air is cool. Mist sometimes hangs low over the fields. Wood smoke drifts lazily above the roofs. There are no streetlights, no distant traffic, no airplane humming somewhere overhead. The world is simply dark and quiet, at least for a moment. Then the animals begin making their opinions known. A sheep bleats. A dog barks. A horse shifts inside its shelter. A rooster, apparently still proud of yesterday's performance, starts again. You briefly consider throwing something at it, but the rooster is technically useful, so it survives. This is the sort of practical compromise medieval people made constantly. You did not necessarily keep an animal because you thought it was adorable. You kept it because it produced something: milk, eggs, wool, labor, meat, manure. Even animals that were eventually eaten could have considerable value. While alive, a cow was not simply a cow. It was milk. It was a calf. It was manure for the fields. It was potentially meat. And sometimes it was a form of wealth. So when your cow gets sick, this is not merely an unfortunate afternoon. It can become an economic problem, a very large one. You check the animals. Then you begin preparing for the day. There's water to collect. This sounds simple. It is not. Today, most of us can walk into a kitchen and turn a handle. Water appears. This is so ordinary that we barely notice it. For medieval peasants, getting water could be a regular chore. Depending on the village, you might have a well, a spring, a stream, or another local source. You carry containers. You walk there. You fill them. You carry them back. And then you do it again. Water is heavy, which means that an ordinary household can spend a surprising amount of time moving water from one place to another. And if the water source is some distance away, congratulations. Your morning exercise has already begun. There is no gym membership. There is simply a bucket. You bring the water home. Now the fire needs attention. Fire is central to medieval domestic life. It provides warmth. It provides light. It cooks food. It dries things. It makes cold weather survivable. But fire also has to be managed carefully. There is no thermostat. You cannot simply set the house to 22 degrees. If the fire dies, the room gets cold. If it burns too strongly, fuel disappears quickly. And fuel itself has to be gathered. Wood is valuable. Depending on local arrangements, access to woodland may be regulated. Peasants might gather fallen branches or use designated areas. But forests are not necessarily an unlimited free supermarket for firewood. Medieval authorities cared about forests. Landowners cared about trees. Kings cared about hunting grounds. And ordinary villagers often had complicated rights governing what they could collect. So even gathering enough fuel to keep your household warm could involve rules. Rules were everywhere. This is one of the less obvious features of medieval rural life. Modern people sometimes imagine a medieval village as a collection of huts sitting freely in a giant wilderness. But most settled agricultural landscapes were organized. Fields were divided. Land rights mattered. Common pastures existed. Meadows were managed. Woodlands were regulated. Village customs were important. And someone, somewhere, usually had an opinion about what you were allowed to do. Sometimes that person was your lord. Sometimes the church. Sometimes the village community itself. And occasionally all three. Because apparently one layer of bureaucracy wasn't enough. You begin to walk toward the fields. The village is waking now. Other peasants are emerging from their homes. Some carry tools. Others lead animals. Children follow adults. Older people may remain near the household, doing work that doesn't require as much physical strength. There is no single schedule for everyone. A farmer's work depends on the season. This matters enormously. Medieval life is seasonal in a way that modern life isn't. Today, your January schedule may look surprisingly similar to your July schedule. You still go to work. The supermarket is still open. The lights still turn on. The internet still works. For a medieval peasant, January and July are almost different worlds. In spring, the fields demand attention. Seeds must be planted. Animals need care. Tools need preparation. Summer brings long working days. Then comes harvest, and harvest is one of the busiest periods of the entire year. Autumn brings another round of work. Winter slows certain agricultural tasks, but it doesn't create unlimited free time. There are repairs, animals, firewood, food processing, clothing, household work, and preparation for the next agricultural cycle. So even winter has its own list. There is always a list. You reach the fields. And now we need to talk about the land itself. Medieval agriculture could be remarkably sophisticated for its time. People were not stupid. They understood soil. They understood seasons. They understood which crops performed better in certain conditions. They understood animals. They watched the weather. They learned from parents and grandparents. And they developed systems that could support large populations despite limited technology. One famous system was the open field system. In many parts of medieval Europe, large fields were divided into strips. Individual households might cultivate scattered strips rather than owning. The village had to cooperate. If one person decided to plant something completely different at the wrong time, that could interfere with the broader system. So the community had rules. Point one giant rectangular farm. This arrangement could look strange from a modern perspective. Why would you want your land scattered all over the place? Well, because it could distribute risk. Different strips might have slightly different soils. And community systems could coordinate when fields were planted or harvested. It also meant that agriculture was not purely individual. Again, more rules. The medieval peasant wakes up, works, plants, harvests, pays obligations, and follows rules. It is beginning to sound like the world's least exciting administrative simulation, but the system had a purpose. Agriculture is a cooperative activity when everyone depends on the same landscape. Water has to be managed, animals have to be moved, fields have to be protected, harvests have to be coordinated, and common land has to be used according to agreed customs. The village is therefore not just a collection of families. It is a network. You depend on other people, and other people depend on you. This could be comforting. It could also be irritating, because communities are wonderful until someone starts arguing about where the boundary between two fields actually is. And medieval people were perfectly capable of arguing about boundaries. Land was valuable. Even a small piece mattered. A strip of fertile soil could contribute to a family's survival. So disputes over property were serious. But let's return to the field. You are working. The morning slowly passes. The plow moves through the soil. If you are using animal power, the animals do much of the pulling, but humans still guide them and control the equipment. Plowing is exhausting. The soil resists. Roots catch. Stones appear. The weather can make everything easier or much harder. If the ground is too wet, working it may be difficult. If it is too dry, it becomes hard. Agriculture requires timing, and timing depends on nature, which means the medieval farmer spends an enormous amount of mental energy watching the sky. Clouds, rain, wind, frost, heat. You learn to read weather patterns because your food depends on them. And sometimes the sky simply refuses to cooperate. A late frost can damage crops. Too much rain can ruin fields. Drought can reduce yields. Storms can destroy plants. And if harvests fail badly enough, food prices rise. This is where the fragile nature of medieval life becomes particularly obvious. A peasant household might be perfectly responsible. They might work hard. They might save grain. They might maintain their tools. They might care for their animals. And then the weather happens. There is no negotiation with weather. You cannot send an angry letter. You cannot complain to customer support. You simply wait and hope. This uncertainty shaped medieval thinking. People prayed for good weather. They held religious processions. They asked saints for protection. They used practical agricultural knowledge at the same time. There was no contradiction in this world. You could know that seeds needed the right soil and still pray for rain. Human beings have always been good at doing both. By late morning, hunger begins to return. You stop for something to eat. Perhaps some bread, maybe cheese, perhaps a little leftover pottage. The food is plain, but plain food can be filling, and filling matters. Calories are useful, when your entire day involves physical labor. There's also beer or ale in some regions and periods, though its role varied. And before anyone imagines a medieval peasant sitting around drinking all day, remember that producing alcoholic drinks also takes resources. Grain has to be grown, processed, fermented, stored. Nothing appears magically. Even the simplest meal represents work. That is something modern people rarely think about. A loaf of bread looks simple, but behind it is a chain of labor. The land, the seed, the plowing, the sowing, the harvesting, the threshing, the milling, the baking, and finally, the loaf sitting in your hand. For the medieval peasant, that chain is visible. You know where your food came from, because you may have helped produce it. You continue working. And eventually the sun begins its slow journey toward afternoon. Your body is tired, but the day isn't finished. There may be another task waiting at home. Perhaps the roof needs repair. Maybe the fence has fallen. Maybe a tool has broken. Maybe the animals need attention. Maybe someone needs to visit the mill. And the mill is another important part of village life. If you grow grain, you need to turn it into usable flour. Mills could be powered by water or wind, depending on location and technology. In many areas, mills were controlled by lords. That meant peasants could be required to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. So even turning your own grain into flour could involve an economic obligation. Imagine growing wheat, harvesting it, threshing it, carrying it, and then being told, essentially, excellent, now pay me for the privilege of grinding it. Very medieval. You continue along the road. The village becomes busy again. A traveler passes. A merchant may arrive. Perhaps someone is leading a cart. Perhaps a priest is walking between settlements. Perhaps a noble official passes through. And everyone notices. Medieval villages were not completely isolated. There were roads, markets, pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, clergy, travelers. News moved. Slowly, but it moved. A peasant might hear about a distant king without ever seeing him. The king might be almost mythical. A name, a face on a coin, a distant authority. The peasant's world could therefore feel both very small and surprisingly connected. You know your village intimately. You know the neighboring villages. You know the nearest market town. And beyond that, the world becomes increasingly vague. Rome might be impossibly far away. Paris might sound like another universe. London could be a place you have only heard about. Yet taxes, wars, church decisions, and royal policies could still reach you. That is the strange thing about medieval society. Distance mattered, but authority traveled. Eventually, evening begins. The work slows. You return home. Your feet are dirty. Your hands are sore. Your stomach wants more food. And there is still household work waiting. The animals are fed. The fire is rebuilt. Food is prepared. Someone repairs a garment. Someone checks the roof. Children settle down. The room becomes warm. And then, slowly, the village becomes quiet. You lie down. The straw mattress is still there. Faithful, unforgiving. You pull the blanket over yourself. Tomorrow will be similar, but not exactly, because medieval life is never perfectly predictable. A birth, a marriage, a sick animal, a good harvest, a bad harvest, a visitor, a new tax, a religious festival, a broken cart. Something will happen, and the peasant will adapt. That may be the most important part of the story. Medieval peasants were not simply miserable people wandering around waiting for history to happen to them. They were farmers, parents, craft workers, neighbors, believers, tenants, landholders, consumers, and members of communities. They complained. They joked. They fell in love. They got annoyed with their neighbors. They raised children. They worried about money. They hoped for good weather. They had ordinary dreams. Their world was difficult, but it was still a world filled with ordinary human life. So let the village grow quiet again. Let the fire burn low. The animals settle down. The fields disappear into darkness. And somewhere beneath a rough roof, our peasant finally closes his eyes. Tomorrow, the village will ask for his time again. But tonight, for a few peaceful hours, it belongs to him. Mostly, Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the ordinary, exhausting, occasionally ridiculous world of the medieval peasant. So settle back in. Let the room stay dark. You don't need to imagine a castle tonight. No royal bedroom. No jewel crown. No enormous banquet where some nobleman is eating 17 different kinds of meat while everyone else stands around pretending not to stare. Instead, imagine a small village waking up. A few houses, a church, some animals, fields stretching into the distance. And inside one of those houses, a family is beginning another ordinary day. The first thing they need is food, which sounds obvious. But food is one of the central problems of medieval life. Not because medieval people didn't understand cooking. They did. Not because they didn't know what tasted good. They absolutely did. The problem was simply getting enough of it. And getting enough of it year after year, that is a very different challenge. For a modern person, hunger is often temporary. You miss lunch. You get hungry. You order something. 20 minutes later, your problem has been solved by a delivery driver who probably deserves more appreciation than civilization currently gives him. For a medieval peasant, there was no such rescue. If the household ran short of grain in February, there was no supermarket. If the harvest had been poor, there was no emergency truck arriving from another continent. If prices rose, you couldn't simply switch to a different grocery store. You had to work with what existed. And what existed was usually grain. Lots of grain. Bread was one of the great foundations of medieval European diets. Wheat was especially desirable. But wheat was not the only grain. Rye, barley, oats, and other grains were important depending on region, climate, soil, and local customs. The exact diet of a medieval peasant could vary enormously. A peasant in England did not necessarily eat exactly like one in northern France. A villager in southern Europe had different crops available from someone living in Scandinavia. Geography matters. Climate matters. And medieval people were very good at using whatever the landscape gave them. Still, grain was the great dependable foundation. It could be stored, ground into flour, cooked into porridge, made into bread, turned into ale or other fermented drinks. It was practical, it was filling, and it could be produced in large quantities. So the morning meal might involve bread, perhaps some cheese, perhaps leftovers from the previous evening, perhaps a little pottage. And pottage deserves some attention, because the word sounds rather mysterious. In reality, it was essentially a cooked mixture. Grain, vegetables, legumes, herbs, and sometimes meat or other ingredients could be combined in a pot. The contents depended on what the household had available. Think of it as the medieval answer to the modern question, what can I make with whatever is left in the kitchen? The difference is that your modern kitchen has a refrigerator. The medieval kitchen has a pot and hope. Pottage could be simple. It could also be surprisingly good. There is a temptation to imagine medieval food as universally disgusting. It wasn't. People knew how to season food. They used herbs. They used onions and garlic where available. They used salt when they could afford it. They used fermented products. They used fats. They used whatever ingredients their region provided. The problem wasn't that medieval people couldn't cook. The problem was that expensive ingredients were expensive, and the poor were still poor. Spices are a good example. People often imagine medieval Europeans constantly throwing exotic spices into everything. There certainly was a taste for spices among wealthy households. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, and other imported seasonings could be prized. But these were not ordinary peasant kitchen staples. A medieval peasant was not casually sprinkling imported pepper onto a bowl of porridge while complaining about the lack of turmeric. The spice trade was complicated and expensive. Luxury ingredients were luxury ingredients. For an ordinary household, herbs grown locally were much more realistic, and salt was extremely important. Salt helps preserve food. That matters in a world without refrigerators. Meat can spoil. Fish can spoil. Dairy products have limited shelf lives. Salt allows certain foods to be preserved for longer. So salt isn't merely seasoning. It is technology. A household that can preserve food has a better chance of making its supplies last. And making supplies last is the great medieval game, because a harvest doesn't simply have to feed you today. It has to carry you toward the next harvest. This creates a strange psychological rhythm. After harvest, the household has more food. The stores are full. People can breathe a little easier. But then the months pass. The stored grain slowly disappears. Winter arrives. Then spring. And eventually the household reaches the difficult period before the next harvest. This period has sometimes been described as a hungry gap. The exact experience varied, but the basic problem was real. Old supplies were running low. The new harvest had not yet arrived. And suddenly that sack of grain you were so pleased with 6 months ago looks considerably less impressive. This is why storage mattered. Granaries, barrels, jars, baskets, cellars, whatever containers were available. Food had to be protected from moisture, pests, rot, mold, and animals that had their own very strong opinions about free food. Rats and mice were not medieval inventions, of course, but they were excellent at finding stored grain. And unfortunately, they had no respect for your agricultural investments. A family could work for months to grow grain. Then a tiny creature could wander in at night and decide that the pantry belonged to him now. There was also the problem of milling. Grain isn't immediately bred. It must be processed. The grain is threshed. The chaff is separated. Then it is ground. Grinding grain is hard work. Hand querns could be used. Larger mills made the process easier, but access could be controlled. And this is another example of how many layers of labor sit behind a simple loaf. Today, you pick up bread. In medieval Europe, bread represented an entire chain of human effort. Someone grew the grain. Someone harvested it. Someone threshed it. Someone transported it. Someone milled it. Someone mixed the dough. Someone kneaded it. Someone baked it. And then someone ate it, preferably before it became too stale. This also explains why bread was culturally important. Bread wasn't merely food. It was central to daily life. The phrase bread and butter doesn't really capture the medieval importance of bread, because butter wasn't universally available or equally important everywhere. But bread itself was fundamental. And when bread became expensive, people noticed. Very quickly, food prices could become politically sensitive. Urban populations depended on grain arriving from the countryside. Poor harvests could create shortages. Shortages could raise prices, and high prices could cause unrest. The humble grain market, therefore, had consequences far beyond the village. But our peasant isn't thinking about international economics. He is thinking about lunch. And lunch is modest. Perhaps some bread. Perhaps pottage. Perhaps onions. Perhaps a little cheese. Maybe an egg. The meal depends on the household. Children eat. Adults eat. And then everyone goes back to work. One thing that can be surprising is how important dairy products could be. Milk doesn't keep fresh for long, so it could be turned into cheese or other preserved forms. Cheese is convenient. It stores better. It can provide protein and fat, and it travels reasonably well. If you own a cow, goat, or sheep, you have access to a useful food resource. But again, owning livestock isn't free. Animals need food. They need shelter. They can become sick. They can die. And some animals are more useful alive than dead. A cow can produce milk for years. So eating it might make very little economic sense unless circumstances force the decision. Pigs, on the other hand, could be extremely useful. They eat things humans don't necessarily want. They grow quickly, and they provide meat and fat. Chickens are useful too. Eggs are valuable, and chickens reproduce, which is another reason the medieval peasant household was full of calculations. Not mathematical calculations, necessarily, but constant practical calculations. Can we eat this? Can we sell this? Can we save this? Can we use this for seed? Can we keep this animal through winter? Can we afford to lose this? Everything has consequences. Even a loaf of bread. Even an egg. Even a chicken. And then there are feasts. Because medieval peasants did not eat exactly the same thing every day. Religious festivals, weddings, community celebrations, local traditions, harvest celebrations. These could provide opportunities for better food. A feast might include more meat, better bread, cheese, alcoholic drinks, seasonal foods. and perhaps desserts or sweetened foods were available. People enjoyed food. Of course they did. Being poor doesn't eliminate the human ability to appreciate a good meal. If anything, scarcity can make special meals more memorable. Imagine eating ordinary bread and pottage for weeks. Then suddenly there is roasted meat. You would remember that, probably for years. And someone would inevitably eat too much, because apparently humanity has remained remarkably consistent. Let's drift back to the ordinary day. After the meal, there is work. And one of the most important forms of work is food preparation itself. Women in medieval households often had enormous responsibilities involving food production and preparation. This included baking, brewing, dairy processing, preserving food, cooking, gathering fuel, collecting water, and caring for children. But it is important not to imagine a rigid universal division of labor. Medieval communities varied. Men, women, and children all contributed to household economies in different ways. Women could work in fields. Men could perform domestic tasks. Children worked according to age and ability. The household was an economic unit. Everyone contributed, and everyone was tired. This is particularly important when we talk about children. Medieval childhood was not simply miniature adulthood. Children played. They learned. They had friendships. They had games. They developed their own social worlds. But children also worked. The age and nature of that work varied. Older children could herd animals, help with crops, carry goods, assist with household tasks, learn crafts, and eventually enter adult economic life. There was no universal moment when someone suddenly became an adult at 18. Life stages were more flexible. A 12-year-old might have responsibilities that would surprise a modern teenager, but they were still a child in many ways. They still needed affection. They still played. They still complained. They still managed to annoy their parents. Again, some things never change. And then there is clothing, because food isn't the only thing that needs preserving. Clothes need to survive too. A peasant household cannot casually replace clothing every season. Fabric is expensive in terms of labor, so garments are patched, altered, reused, passed down. Old cloth can become something else. Nothing is wasted casually. This is not necessarily because medieval people were morally opposed to waste. It's because resources were limited. A scrap of cloth still has value. A broken tool might be repaired. A damaged pot might be fixed. What might be reused. Everything has another possible life. The modern concept of disposable goods would be almost unimaginable. If you own one good knife, you want that knife to last. If the handle breaks, you fix it. If the blade becomes dull, you sharpen it. If your shoes develop a hole, you repair them. You do not simply walk into a store and purchase another pair, because the nearest store may not exist. And even if it does, you may not have the money. This creates a culture of maintenance. People know how things work. They understand materials. They know which repairs are possible. They know who in the village is good at which skill. The blacksmith is important. The carpenter is important. The miller is important. The potter is important. The weaver is important. The village depends on specialists, even though many people also perform multiple jobs. And somewhere in all this, the peasant's day continues. Food is eaten. Food is prepared. Food is stored. Food is worried about. Because food is never far from the mind. The next harvest is always approaching, or always too far away, depending on the season. And this is perhaps the great irony of medieval agriculture. The peasant is surrounded by food. Fields stretch everywhere. Grain grows in the soil. Animals live nearby. Gardens produce vegetables. Yet the possibility of hunger is always present, because producing food is not the same as having a secure food supply. A storm can ruin crops. A disease can strike animals. A family member can become unable to work. A tool can break. A tax can be demanded. Prices can change. A war somewhere nearby can disrupt trade. And all of these things can push a household closer to the edge. Still, life continues. People marry. Children are born. Markets open. Fields are planted. bread is baked. Someone argues over a boundary. Someone loses a chicken. Someone finds a chicken. Someone claims the chicken was always theirs. And the village continues. Night arrives again. The fire glows. The family gathers. The day's work is mostly finished. Outside, the fields are dark. Inside, there is warmth. For a few hours, at least. And as you lie down on your rough mattress, perhaps you realize something. The miserable life of a medieval peasant was not miserable every second. There were good meals, warm fires, family jokes, festivals, friendships, quiet evenings, beautiful summer mornings, the smell of bread baking, the satisfaction of a successful harvest. There was happiness. It was simply happiness living inside a world with much narrower margins. And tomorrow, the work begins again. The fields will wait. The animals will wait. The bread will need making. The fire will need tending. And somewhere in the darkness, that completely unreasonable rooster will eventually decide that 5 in the morning is the perfect time to announce the arrival of another day. So close your eyes. Let the village become quiet. Let the fire burn lower. And for tonight, there is nothing left to harvest. Nothing left to carry. Nothing left to repair. Just sleep. For a few hours, the medieval peasant can finally stop working. And so can you. Hey guys. Tonight we continue our quiet journey into the life of the medieval peasant. The morning has come again. And as usual, nobody has invented the snooze button. So you wake, slowly, reluctantly. The house is dark. The fire has burned down to a few glowing pieces of wood. The air inside is cold. And for a moment, you remain under the blanket. Try to convince yourself that perhaps the world has changed overnight. Perhaps the fields have disappeared. Perhaps the animals have learned to feed themselves. Perhaps your landlord has suddenly decided that everyone deserves a month off. Unfortunately, no such miracle has occurred. The field is still there. The animals are still hungry. And somewhere outside, that rooster preparing another completely unnecessary announcement. So you get up, but tonight, instead of following you immediately into the fields, let's stay inside the house for a while. Because the medieval peasant's home tells us a great deal about the way ordinary people lived. And it was not exactly a cozy little cottage from a modern fantasy movie. There were, of course, beautiful medieval houses. There were large farmhouses. There were substantial village buildings. There were wealthy peasants who owned more land and better possessions. But for many poorer households, the home was small, practical, and built around survival. A typical rural house might use timber, wattle and daub, stone, thatch, or combinations of these materials depending on the region. The exact appearance varied enormously. Some houses were surprisingly sturdy. Others were much more basic. But almost all had one thing in common. They had to serve many purposes. Your house was bedroom, kitchen, living room, storage area, workshop, and sometimes animal shelter. Yes, animals could be part of the same building complex, and in some circumstances livestock might be kept extremely close to the household. Not because medieval peasants thought sleeping beside a cow was an exciting lifestyle choice. It was practical. Animals provided heat. They needed protection. And separating every function into different buildings required more resources. Space was expensive. Materials were expensive. Labor was expensive. So the house had to work hard. Much like everyone inside it, the central feature was often the hearth. Fire was essential. Without it, winter could become dangerous. The hearth provided heat and allowed food to be cooked. It also provided light. During the day, sunlight came through openings in the walls or windows. But at night, the fire became the main source of illumination. Candles existed. Lamps existed. But artificial lighting was not something to waste casually. So darkness was a normal part of life. Imagine finishing work at sunset. You come home. You eat. You talk. You repair something. And then the world simply becomes dark. There is no television waiting. No glowing screen. No internet. No late-night shopping. Eventually, there is just a fire. And perhaps conversation. This could actually make evenings surprisingly social. People told stories. They talked. They worked while sitting near the hearth. Someone might spin thread. Someone might repair clothing. Children might listen to adults talking. And in winter, the entire household could gather around the warmth. The house was not necessarily comfortable, but it was the center of life. And then there was the smoke. This is one of those details that modern people tend to forget. An open hearth inside a house produces smoke. A lot of smoke. Some medieval buildings had openings or chimneys that improved ventilation. But chimney technology developed gradually and varied by region and period. In a simpler dwelling, smoke could linger. Your eyes might sting. Your clothes could smell strongly of smoke. Your hair could smell of smoke. Everything could smell of smoke. After a while, you probably stopped noticing. Much like living next to a busy road eventually makes you stop hearing traffic. Except the traffic is your fireplace, and it is trying to turn your lungs into a historical artifact. Still, the hearth was indispensable, and fuel had to be collected. Wood, peat in some regions, other combustible materials. Every piece of fuel represented labor. Someone had to gather it, carry it, store it, and use it carefully. This is another reason medieval houses were not brightly heated all day. You couldn't simply turn up the thermostat. If you wanted more warmth, you needed more fuel. And if winter was long, fuel supplies mattered. Now imagine the family. A medieval household could include parents, children, relatives, servants, lodgers, or other people depending on circumstances. Not every family looked the same. Some households were large. Some were small. Some children died young. Some adults died young. Marriage patterns vary by region and social class. And life expectancy statistics can be misleading because high infant and child mortality strongly affected the average. A person who survived childhood could potentially live much longer than the often quoted medieval life expectancy suggests. But surviving childhood was itself a major challenge. This is something we have to approach carefully. Medieval people were not constantly dying every 5 minutes. Most days were ordinary. People grew old. Grandparents existed. There were elderly people in villages. But disease and complications from injury or childbirth could be far more dangerous than they are for most people today. There were no modern antibiotics, no modern surgical techniques, no reliable anesthesia, no modern emergency rooms, and no doctor waiting nearby with a clipboard and a very expensive parking ticket. Instead, people relied on family knowledge, local healers, herbal remedies, religious practices, midwives, and whatever formal medical care existed in their region. Some treatments were useful, some were harmless, some were ineffective, and some were probably best left in the past. Still, medieval people were not ignorant of medicine. They observed illness. They understood symptoms. They knew that wounds needed care. They knew that certain plants had medicinal properties. They had medical traditions inherited from earlier civilizations. But their understanding of disease was very different from modern germ theory. They did not know about bacteria and viruses in the modern sense. So when illness appeared, people often had to interpret it using the knowledge available to them. And illness could affect the entire household. If one person became unable to work, someone else had to compensate. If a parent became sick, children might take on more responsibilities. If a worker was injured during harvest, the consequences could be serious. There was very little separation between health and economics. Your body was part of your household's productive capacity. That sounds terribly cold, but it was simply reality. If you couldn't work, there might be less food. If there was less food, everyone suffered. So families depended on one another. This also explains why children were important, not simply emotionally. Economically, too, a child could eventually work, help with animals, collect fuel, assist in fields, care for younger siblings, learn a trade, and contribute to the household. But childhood still contained affection and play. Children did not spend every waking second carrying sacks of grain. They played games. They made toys. They imitated adults. They explored. They formed friendships. They learned by watching. And eventually, gradually, they became part of the adult world. For a child, the medieval village was an entire universe. The fields were enormous. The forest seemed endless. The church was a major landmark. The market town was exciting. A traveling merchant could bring stories from places a child had never imagined. And beyond all of it was a much larger world. Kings, wars, distant cities, foreign lands, saints, pilgrims. All of these existed, but most were far away. The village remained the center. And village life could be intensely personal. People knew one another. Families had histories. Everyone remembered old disputes. Someone's grandfather had once owned a certain strip of land. Someone else's family had been here for generations. A marriage could connect two households. A disagreement could last for years. And gossip was essentially a free village entertainment service. There was no social media. You didn't need it. Your neighbor was the algorithm. Everyone knew who had argued with whom, who had lost a cow, who had married badly, who was expecting a baby, who owed money, and who had somehow managed to produce an unusually large cabbage. The last one may actually have been worth discussing, because food production mattered. The household garden could be important. Vegetables, herbs, legumes, and other crops could supplement grain. Depending on the region, people might grow cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, beans, carrots, turnips, or other vegetables. The garden wasn't simply decorative. It was another part of the household economy. And then there were animals. Chickens scratching around, geese making unreasonable amounts of noise, pigs wandering through mud, sheep, goats, cattle, horses were affordable. Animals were everywhere, and they created work. A cow needs feeding. A pig needs attention. Sheep need managing. Chickens need protecting. Animals can escape. Animals can become ill. Animals can eat things they weren't supposed to eat. And animals have never been particularly interested in human schedules. Still, livestock can make a household more secure. A cow could provide milk. Sheep could provide wool. A pig could provide meat. Chickens could provide eggs. The household therefore existed as a small economic ecosystem. Nothing was completely separate. Food, clothing, fuel, animals, land, labor, and family were all connected. And then there was marriage. For many peasants, marriage was not simply about romantic love. Of course people could fall in love. Of course affection mattered. But marriage also involved property, labor, family connections, children, economic survival, and local customs. A marriage could bring two households together. A couple might need access to land. They might need a home. They might depend on parents. And starting a new household could be difficult. There was no simple process of moving into an apartment with a refrigerator and 3 months of free internet. You needed resources, furniture, tools, clothing, animals perhaps, land access, food, a home, and enough stability to survive. This meant many young people did not simply marry whenever they felt emotionally ready. Economic circumstances mattered. In some parts of medieval Europe, people married relatively late by the standards we might imagine. In others, patterns differed. Again, medieval Europe was not one uniform society, but everywhere marriage had practical consequences, and children followed. Sometimes quickly, a pregnant woman continued working for much of pregnancy. Women performed agricultural labor, household labor, food preparation, textile work, and many other tasks. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous parts of adult life. Midwives played important roles. Family members helped. Communities offered support. But complications could become serious very quickly. There were no modern maternity wards, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no emergency surgery in the modern sense. So pregnancy carried risks that modern medicine has dramatically reduced. Yet, medieval women were not helpless. They possessed knowledge. They knew traditional techniques. They knew herbs. They understood childbirth through generations of experience. And they relied heavily on community knowledge. Still, the risks were real. And every successful birth could feel like a major event. A new child meant another member of the household, another mouth to feed, another person to love, and eventually another pair of hands to work. Life and labor were intertwined. As evening approaches, the household becomes quieter. The children settle. The fire burns. Someone prepares tomorrow's food. Someone repairs a shoe. Someone spins thread. Perhaps there is conversation. Perhaps there is prayer. Perhaps someone simply sits in silence. The medieval evening was not always miserable. Sometimes it was peaceful, and that matters. Because if we describe the entire medieval peasant experience as nothing but suffering, we lose the human being inside the history. This was not a population of miserable robots. They had jokes. They had friendships. They had favorite foods. They had annoying relatives. They had people they loved. They had places they preferred. They had memories. They had hopes. And they had dreams about tomorrow. Even in a hard world, people adapt. They create routines. They find comfort in familiar things. A warm fire, a full stomach, a healthy child, a successful harvest, a good neighbor, a quiet evening. These things mattered, perhaps more than we realize. The fire burns lower now. The room becomes dark. The family settles down. You lie back onto the straw. The mattress is still not especially impressive, but you're tired enough not to care. Outside, the village is almost silent. The animals are resting. The fields are dark. The road is empty. And tomorrow morning, the whole cycle will begin again. Wake, work, eat, carry, repair, harvest, sleep, repeat. It is not a glamorous life. It is not the life of kings. There are no golden crowns here. No grand castles. No silk curtains. Just a wooden house. A tired family. A small fire and the stubborn determination to make it through another day. And perhaps that is what makes the medieval peasant's story so interesting. History often remembers the people at the top. Kings, queens, generals, bishops. But most people live much closer to the soil. They planted the food, raised the animals, built the houses, made the clothing, paid the taxes, and quietly kept the entire society running. They rarely had their portraits painted. Nobody wrote elaborate biographies about them. But they were there, every morning, every winter, every harvest, doing the ordinary work that allowed everyone else to live extraordinary lives. So let the fire go out. Let the village become dark. And let our peasants sleep. Because tomorrow, the sun will rise. And when it does, there will be another field waiting. There always is. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval peasant. The village is waking. The fire is being stirred. The animals are making their usual complaints. And somewhere beyond the houses, the fields are waiting. They have been waiting all night, which is very considerate of them. Unfortunately, they are not going to work themselves. So you get dressed, you eat whatever breakfast is available, and you step outside. The morning air is cool. Mist hangs over the fields. The ground is damp beneath your feet. For a few moments, the village looks almost peaceful. And it is peaceful, but peaceful does not mean easy. For a medieval peasant, the landscape itself is a workplace. The fields are the office. The road is the commute. The barn is the storage room. The animals are co-workers. And unfortunately, the co-workers occasionally bite. Today, the work begins with the soil. Agriculture is not one job. It is hundreds of small jobs connected together. Before anything grows, the land must be prepared. Depending on the season, that can mean plowing, breaking up soil, removing weeds, repairing boundaries, spreading manure, preparing seed, checking drainage, and making sure the animals are ready. The plow is one of the most important tools in medieval agriculture. Different regions use different designs. The heavy wheel plow was particularly useful in some northern European soils. Lighter plows were better suited to other environments. There was no single perfect medieval plow. Farmers used what worked in their landscape, and the plow depended on animals. Oxen were especially valuable. They were strong, they were reliable, and they could pull heavy equipment. Horses were also used, increasingly in some areas, particularly where agricultural techniques and harnesses made them practical. But animals were expensive to maintain. They needed food. They needed shelter. They could become sick. And during winter, feeding a large animal that wasn't currently working could consume valuable resources. So farmers had to plan. An ox was not simply a machine. It was an investment. And if the ox died, the farmer didn't simply visit a dealership. He had a problem, a very expensive problem. You walk toward the field. Other villagers are already working. Some are preparing soil. Some are tending animals. Some are working in gardens. Others have different tasks. The medieval village is busy long before most modern people have finished their first cup of coffee, and then the work begins. You grip the tool. You push, pull, lift, turn, walk, again, and again, and again. There is no music playing, no motivational speech, no productivity app telling you that you're currently operating at 87% efficiency. There is only the rhythm of labor, and rhythm matters. People become skilled at repetitive work. You learn how to use your body. You learn when to push, when to rest, how to avoid wasting energy. You learn which tools are best for which task. Knowledge like this is passed from one generation to another. A child watches a parent. An apprentice watches a craftsman. A younger farmer watches an older one. The knowledge isn't usually written down in a manual. It is demonstrated, repeated, corrected, remembered. This is one reason medieval communities could function despite limited formal education. Practical knowledge was everywhere. You knew how to plant, how to harvest, how to care for animals, how to repair a fence, how to preserve food, how to recognize certain plants, how to judge weather, how to build, how to mend, and how to survive when things went wrong. You continue working. The sun rises higher. The mist disappears. The field becomes warmer. Your shirt begins to stick to your back. Your hands are dirty. Your shoulders hurt. And it isn't even noon. This is where the phrase, work all day, starts to mean something very literal. Agricultural labor was seasonal. During busy periods, work days could be extremely long. Harvest was particularly demanding. When grain was ready, timing mattered. You could not simply say, we'll get to it next Tuesday. The crop could be damaged by weather. So the village worked quickly. People cut grain, gathered it, transported it, stacked it. Then came threshing. Threshing separates grain from the stalk and chaff. It was labor-intensive. The grain then had to be cleaned and stored. Every stage required time. And because so many households were doing this simultaneously, harvest season could transform the entire village. People who normally worked on different tasks suddenly had one shared priority: get the harvest in. This could create a sense of community. Everyone was busy, everyone was tired, and everyone knew that failure would affect everyone. But there was also something satisfying about harvest. After months of uncertainty, you could finally see the result. The grain was there, the barns filled, the storage areas became crowded. The household could breathe, at least for a little while. But before harvest comes planting, and before planting comes preparation. So much of medieval agriculture is about doing work months before you see any reward. You plant a seed, then wait. You don't know exactly what will happen. The weather may cooperate, or it may not. The soil may be productive, or disappointing. Pests may appear. Animals may wander into the field. And throughout all of this, you keep working. The medieval farmer had a close relationship with uncertainty. This is one of the major differences between modern and medieval agricultural life. Modern farmers still face uncertainty, of course, but they have forecasting, insurance, machinery, fertilizers, modern crop varieties, scientific soil analysis, irrigation, pesticides, storage systems, transportation networks, and government programs in many countries. A medieval peasant had experience, observation, community knowledge, and prayer. That was about it. And prayer was sometimes quite reasonable. When your entire livelihood depends on rain, you become extremely interested in rain. Too much is bad. Too little is bad. The correct amount at the correct time would be ideal. Naturally, nature refuses to cooperate perfectly. Then there are weeds. Weeds do not care about your economic plans. They grow wherever they please. So fields require constant attention. Pulling, cutting, digging, removing, and then doing it again. Because weeds have an astonishing commitment to their careers. A field can look beautiful from a distance. Green, peaceful, almost romantic. Up close, it is a battlefield of plants competing for nutrients, water, and sunlight, and you are the unpaid referee. The medieval peasant also had to deal with pests, insects, birds, rodents, animals. A flock of birds can do considerable damage to crops. So can insects. And if stored grain becomes infested, the problem continues after harvest. The peasant therefore spends much of life protecting food, growing it, harvesting it, storing it, protecting it, and finally eating it. A lot of work for something that disappears in 10 minutes. But that's agriculture. Then there are fences. Fences matter. Animals need to be controlled. Fields need protection. Boundaries need maintaining. A broken fence can create chaos. If your neighbor's animals wander into your crops, you have a problem. And suddenly two people who have lived next to each other for 20 years are having a very serious discussion about whose goat did what. The goat, meanwhile, has no idea why everyone is upset. This sort of local dispute was part of ordinary village life. And villages had ways of handling them. Custom, local courts, manorial officials, community pressure, sometimes formal legal systems. The medieval countryside was not lawless. It had rules, lots of rules. Some were written, some were customary, some were based on memory. And everyone had opinions. You continue working. Eventually, midday arrives. You stop, you eat, then you return to the field. The afternoon stretches out. This is where physical labor becomes monotonous. The same movement, the same ground, the same horizon. And yet, monotony can be calming. There is something almost meditative about repetitive work. You don't have to make complicated decisions every minute. Your body knows what to do. Your mind can wander. You think about home, food, the weather, your children, the next market day, maybe the repair you need to finish, maybe the neighbor who still owes you something, maybe nothing at all. And then the sun moves. Slowly, the shadows lengthen. You continue. Eventually, another important part of the medieval economy comes into view. Crafts. Not everyone is primarily a farmer. Villages and towns contain specialists. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, tanners, masons, shoemakers, brewers, millers, and many others. Some work within households. Some work as independent specialists. Some are associated with guilds, particularly in towns. These people are essential because farming depends on tools. A farmer needs metal. Metal needs a smith. A smith needs fuel and materials. A carpenter needs wood. A weaver needs fiber. Everything connects. The economy is a web. And if one part becomes expensive or unavailable, other parts suffer. Imagine your plow breaks during planting. Not ideal. You need a smith. The smith needs time. You may need to pay. And a delay could affect your entire agricultural schedule. This is why tools were valuable. A good tool could last for years. A broken tool could become a crisis. So repair was important. People learned to maintain equipment. They didn't throw things away casually. A broken handle could be replaced. A blade could be sharpened. A pot could be repaired. A shoe could be patched. Cloth could be reused. The medieval peasant lived in a world where durability mattered. Things had to last. And people had to last too. As evening approaches, the workday finally begins to slow. You gather your tools. You check the animals. You look over the field. Tomorrow there will be more work. But today, at least, the task is finished. You walk home. The village smells of smoke. Someone is cooking. A dog follows you for a while. Children are playing near the houses. An old man sits outside. Two neighbors are talking. A woman is carrying water. Someone is repairing a wooden cart. The village is tired, but alive. You enter your house. Food is waiting. Not much, but enough. You sit near the fire. Your muscles ache. Your hands are rough. Your feet hurt. But there is a certain satisfaction in being finished. You survived another day. The fields are still standing. The animals are fed. The roof hasn't collapsed. Nobody has demanded anything particularly outrageous. By medieval standards, this is an excellent evening. You eat slowly. Someone tells a story. Someone laughs quietly. The fire crackles. Outside, darkness settles over the fields. And as you lie down, you think about tomorrow. There is always a tomorrow. Another field, another task, another sunrise, another long day. But perhaps there is also something else. A market next week, a festival coming soon, a wedding, a visit from a relative, a good harvest, a new pair of shoes. Small things, things that make life feel slightly less repetitive. Because even in a difficult world, people need something to look forward to. And medieval peasants had those things. They were not merely surviving. They were living, slowly, carefully, with fewer choices than we have, but with the same basic human need for comfort, friendship, food, family, and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. The fire becomes smaller. The house grows quiet. Your body finally relaxes. Tomorrow will bring more work, but tomorrow can wait. For now, the fields are dark. The village is still. The animals are sleeping. And the peasant is finally, mercifully, doing absolutely nothing, which may be the greatest luxury of all. Sleep. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval peasant. The village is quiet. The fields are dark. And somewhere in the distance, a dog is barking at something that probably does not deserve this much attention. Inside your little house, the fire has nearly gone out. You are asleep. For the moment, nobody needs anything from you, which is good, because tomorrow the village will begin asking for things again. Not necessarily in an aggressive way. Medieval society was usually much more complicated than that. It was a world of customs, obligations, payments, rights, and relationships. And if you were a peasant, one of the most important relationships in your life was a relationship between you and the person who controlled the land you worked. This is where we meet the medieval lord. Now, when we say lord, it is tempting to imagine some enormous man sitting in a stone castle, wearing a fur-lined cloak and staring dramatically into the distance. Sometimes, yes, but lord could also be a local landowner whose daily life was far less theatrical. The important thing was not necessarily how impressive he looked. It was what rights and authority he possessed. Land was power, and if you worked land belonging to someone else, you could have obligations to that person. This system varied enormously across Europe. There was no single medieval arrangement. Some peasants were free. Some were tenants with particular rents. Some were serfs with restricted rights. Some held land under complicated customary agreements. And those arrangements changed over time. So when we talk about the medieval peasant, we have to avoid imagining one universal system. Still, across many regions, peasants owed some combination of rent, labor, produce, or money. And this could make the household budget rather complicated. You grow grain. You harvest grain. You store grain. And then someone arrives and says very politely that some of the grain belongs somewhere else. You look at your grain. Then you look at the person. Then you look at your grain again. This is not your favorite part of the year. One of the most famous obligations was labor service. In some manorial systems, peasants could be required to work on a lord's land for a certain number of days. This meant that you might spend part of your week working your own holding, and another part working land controlled directly by the lord. This was called labor service. And the exact form varied. The important point is that your time was not completely your own. Time was an economic resource. And the medieval peasant had very little of it to spare. If you had to spend a day working elsewhere, that was a day you weren't working your own fields. So obligations had consequences. Then there were rents. Instead of labor or alongside labor, peasants might owe payments in grain, animals, produce, or money. The exact arrangement depended on the place and period. And over the centuries, many European societies saw changes in how these obligations were structured. Some labor services declined. Money rents became more important in certain areas. Peasants gained greater freedom in some regions. In others, forms of dependence became more rigid. Medieval Europe was constantly changing. But from the peasant's perspective, one thing remained constant. You needed to know what you owed, and you needed to have it ready. This created another layer of anxiety. The harvest wasn't simply about feeding your family. It was also about meeting obligations. If you produce enough, Everyone was happy. Well, perhaps not everyone, but at least the accounting became less unpleasant. Then there was the church. Religion was central to medieval life, and the church was not simply a spiritual institution. It was also a major landowner and economic institution. Tithes were an important form of obligation in many Christian communities. Traditionally, a tithe represented a tenth of certain agricultural production, though the exact collection and application varied considerably for a peasant. The important point was that religious obligations could have a material component. You might grow grain. Some of it went to the Lord. Some might go to the church. Some was needed for seed. Some was needed to feed the family. Some might be sold. And suddenly that enormous pile of grain after harvest doesn't look quite so enormous. This is why peasants carefully calculated, not with spreadsheets, but with memory, experience, and practical judgment. How much grain can we spare? How much should we store? How much should we sell? How much seed do we need? How much can we use for animals? How much must go toward obligations? The medieval household was constantly balancing, and then there were taxes imposed by rulers. Kings and princes needed money. Governments needed resources. Wars were expensive. Administration cost money. Castles needed maintenance. Armies needed supplies. Officials needed salaries or support. So taxation existed at various levels. Again, the exact system varied enormously, but the ordinary person could feel the consequences. A king might be thousands of miles away, or perhaps only a few days' journey. Either way, his policies could eventually reach the village. And this is one of the strange things about medieval government. You might never see the king. You might never speak to a nobleman. You might never visit the royal capital. And yet the authority of distant rulers could still affect what happened in your life. News moved slowly. Taxes could move faster. Very inconvenient. There were also market fees and tolls. If you travel with goods, you might encounter tolls. If you sold products, you might have to pay fees. If you used certain facilities, there could be charges. And one of the most famous examples was the mill. If the local lord controlled a mill, peasants could be required to use it. The miller would grind the grain, and a portion could be taken as a fee. This arrangement made economic sense from the lord's perspective. The mill represented an investment, but from the peasant's perspective, it was another deduction. You already did the growing. You did the harvesting. You carried the grain. And now someone else gets a little piece of it because he owns the machine. You are beginning to understand medieval economics. Ownership matters, and landowners had significant power. But this does not mean every lord was constantly abusing every peasant. The relationship could be more complicated. A lord had responsibilities too. He could be expected to maintain certain infrastructure, provide courts, protect the community, support roads or bridges in certain circumstances, maintain the manor, enforce local law, and provide military protection in the broader feudal system. Of course, how well these responsibilities were fulfilled varied greatly. Humans remain humans. Give someone authority, and they may use it responsibly, or badly, or somewhere in between. The medieval world had its fair share of difficult landlords. It also had practical ones. And peasants themselves were not powerless. They had customary rights. They had community institutions. They could use courts. They could negotiate. They could complain. They could sometimes resist. Collective action mattered. A village community could be surprisingly organized. People knew the boundaries of fields. They knew grazing rights. They knew which woods they could use. They knew local customs. And if an outside authority tried to change an established custom, people could object, sometimes through legal channels, sometimes through petitions, sometimes through collective resistance. Medieval peasants were not silent. They left records of disputes. They went to courts. They complained about officials. They argued over rents. They defended customary rights. And occasionally, when pressures became extreme, rural populations participated in larger revolts. But tonight, our peasant isn't planning a revolution. He is planning dinner. Because even political theory becomes less interesting when you're hungry. You return home after working. The day's obligations are finished. For now, Your household has some grain, some vegetables, maybe some cheese, perhaps an animal, and hopefully enough fuel for the next few weeks. You think about the market. The nearest market town might be several miles away. Walking there takes time, and time is valuable. But markets are important. You can sell surplus goods, buy things you cannot produce yourself, find tools, purchase cloth, acquire salt, meet merchants, hear news, and perhaps discover that someone is selling something you've wanted for months. A knife, a buckle, a piece of fabric, a pot, a better tool. The medieval market was not simply a place for peasants to dump vegetables. It was a social center. News traveled through markets. Rumors travel faster. A traveler might bring stories from a distant town. A merchant might know about political events. A pilgrim might describe a shrine. Someone might mention that a neighboring lord has died. Someone else might insist that a comet means the end of the world. And another person will probably have a completely different explanation. Medieval people were curious. They wanted to know what was happening beyond their village. But information was slow and unreliable. There was no instant verification. If someone told you that the king had become seriously ill, how would you know? You wouldn't. You might hear another version next week. By the time news traveled from one region to another, details could change. Still, the market was one of the places where the wider world entered village life, and the peasant could participate in that economy. This is important. Medieval peasants were not completely outside the market. They produced it themselves, but they also bought and sold goods. The degree of market involvement varied. Some households were more commercial. Some were more self-sufficient. But money increasingly mattered in many medieval economies. Coins circulated. Prices changed. Wages existed. Rent could be paid in money. And over time, monetary transactions became increasingly important in many regions. This created opportunities. A peasant could sell eggs, cheese, grain, animals, cloth, or labor. Perhaps the household had a particularly good year. Maybe there was enough surplus to sell. That money could then be used for something useful. A new tool, better clothing, a marriage expense, a tax, a repair, or simply food during a difficult season. But money could also create problems. If prices rose, the household's purchasing power fell. If taxes increased, money became harder to find. If a family member became ill, expenses could rise. And if harvest failed, there might be less to sell in the first place. So poverty was not simply about having no money. It was about having very little margin. A small setback could become a major one. And this is where medieval poverty becomes easier to understand. Imagine your household has just enough. Not plenty, just enough. You have enough grain, enough fuel, enough clothing, enough animals, enough tools. Then one animal dies. Suddenly you have less milk, less manure, less future breeding potential. Maybe you need to buy something, but buying requires money. So you sell some grain. Now your food reserve is smaller. Then the harvest is slightly worse than expected. Now your reserve is smaller again. This is how households could slide toward hardship, not necessarily through one dramatic disaster, through several small ones, one after another. And that is often how poverty works. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. But there were also good years. A successful harvest could transform a household situation. You might repair the roof, buy better clothing, acquire another animal, save some money, marry a child, expand your holding, pay debts, or simply eat better. A good year mattered. And a good harvest could create optimism. The fields looked healthy. The grain stores were full. The future seemed slightly less threatening. For a medieval peasant, that could be enough to feel rich. Not rich like a noble, but rich enough. And enough was valuable. Night arrives. You sit near the hearth. Perhaps tomorrow you will have to work for the Lord. Perhaps you will work your own field. Perhaps you will go to market. The exact schedule depends on the season. But the obligations remain. You think about your grain, your animals, your family, the coming winter, the next payment. And then you look at the fire. It is warm. Your children are nearby. Everyone has eaten. For tonight, Everything is fine. And perhaps that is how medieval peasants measured security. Not by bank accounts, not by investment portfolios, but by simple questions. Do we have enough food? Is the roof sound? Are the animals healthy? Do we have seed for next year? Can we pay what we owe? Are the children safe? If the answers are mostly yes, then life is manageable. Tomorrow might be difficult, but tonight is quiet. The fire burns, the village sleeps, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the manor house stands. Its walls are stronger, its rooms are larger, its owners are wealthier. But even there, someone is probably worrying about something, because medieval life had an interesting way of reminding everyone that wealth does not eliminate problems. It merely changes their shape. The peasant worries about grain. The lord worries about rents. The king worries about wars. The bishop worries about politics. And somewhere, a nobleman is probably worrying that his dinner has been served 5 minutes late. A tragedy of truly historic proportions. So let the village settle again. Let the fields become silent. Let the last embers glow. Tomorrow, the peasant will wake and return to the same complicated world of land, labor, taxes, markets, and obligations. But for now, there is nothing left to calculate, nothing left to carry, nothing left to pay. Just darkness, warmth, and sleep. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the miserable, muddy, surprisingly complicated life of the medieval peasant. Tonight, we are going to slow things down even more, because some of the hardest parts of medieval life were not dramatic. They were quiet. A cough that lasted too long. A child who suddenly became weak. A winter that seemed to refuse to end. A cow that stopped eating. A field that produced less grain than expected. Nothing spectacular, just ordinary problems. The sort of problems that could quietly turn a reasonably comfortable household into a struggling one. So imagine the village again. The morning is gray. The sun is somewhere behind the clouds. The ground is wet. The air is cold. And winter is approaching. For a medieval peasant, winter is not simply a season. It is a calculation. How much grain remains? How much firewood? How much fodder for the animals? How much food can the household preserve? How long until spring? These questions matter, because winter changes everything. The fields become less productive. Days become shorter. Travel becomes harder, fuel becomes more important, and food stores slowly disappear. A modern winter can be beautiful. Snow outside, warm house, hot drink, blanket, electricity, heating, entertainment. The medieval version is slightly less charming. Snow looks beautiful until you need to walk through it carrying firewood. Cold weather is peaceful until the firewood runs low. And a dark evening is cozy until you realize you have several hours before sunrise and approximately one candle. Still, winter was not simply misery. People adapted. Agricultural work slowed in some areas. This gave households time for other activities. Tools could be repaired. Clothing could be made. Wood could be worked. Spinning and weaving could continue. Animals still needed care. Food still needed preparation. But the rhythm changed. The great agricultural rush of summer was gone. Now the household turned inward. The house became more important. The hearth became more important. And stored food became extremely important. A medieval family had to make its supplies last. Grain was the backbone, but there could be preserved vegetables, dried legumes, cheese, salted meat, smoked foods, stored nuts, depending on region and household resources. Preservation was a survival skill, and people became very good at it. You could dry, salt, smoke, ferment, store. Different methods worked for different foods. The goal was simple: make summer last into winter, and make autumn last into spring. Because the next harvest was months away, that gap could be uncomfortable. If food supplies ran low, people might reduce consumption. Meals could become simpler. Portions could shrink. Better foods might be saved for important occasions. The household might sell animals, or perhaps slaughter one. Everything depended on circumstances. And then there was illness. Disease was a constant presence in medieval life. But we should be careful not to imagine everyone permanently sick. Most people were not. They woke up, worked, 8. Raised families, lived ordinary lives. But when illness came, treatment options were limited. A fever could be dangerous. An infected wound could become serious. Respiratory illnesses could spread. Childbirth could be risky. And chronic conditions could make daily labor difficult. There was no modern understanding of microorganisms. People had different theories about why illness happened. These theories included ideas about bodily balance, environmental conditions, spiritual causes, and many other explanations. Medical traditions drew on ancient authorities. Local knowledge mattered, religious belief mattered, and experience mattered. If a particular herb seemed to help with a certain problem, people remembered if a treatment failed, they might try something else. Medical knowledge was not completely random, but it was limited, and without modern diagnostics, it was difficult to know what was actually happening inside the body. Imagine waking up with a high fever. Today, someone might measure your temperature, call a doctor, get tested, receive medication. A medieval peasant might simply know that you are very sick. The family gathers. Someone prepares a remedy. Someone prays. Someone seeks a healer. And everyone waits. That waiting is important, because waiting is one of the great features of pre-modern medicine. There was a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty creates fear. Not necessarily dramatic fear. Quiet fear, the kind that sits in the room while everyone tries to remain calm. If the sick person is a worker, the household has another problem. Who will do their tasks? Who will collect water? Who will care for animals? Who will work the field? Who will prepare food? A household with little spare labor could struggle quickly. This is why families were so important. A large family could provide more hands. Older children could help. Relatives could assist. Neighbors could help in emergencies. Community networks mattered. If someone was sick, others might bring food, help with animals, watch children, assist with harvest. The medieval village was not a collection of isolated households. It was a community, and communities could be harsh. They could gossip. They could enforce conformity. They could exclude people, but they could also provide support. This is one of the great contradictions of village life. Everyone knows your business, which is annoying, but everyone also knows when you need help, which is useful. Now imagine winter settling in. The fields are mostly quiet. The trees are bare. The days are short. You wake in darkness. You work in darkness. You eat by firelight. You sleep early. Time feels different. Without electric light, the night is enormous. Modern people tend to underestimate this. We can keep our homes bright until midnight. We can work late, read, watch movies, talk to people thousands of miles away. Medieval peasants couldn't. Darkness changed the daily rhythm. People often went to bed earlier. They rested. They talked. They worked by the hearth. And sleep came more naturally. Of course, sleep wasn't always peaceful. Cold, noise, children, animals, smoke, uncomfortable bedding. All of these could interfere. But there was no alternative. You slept where you lived, and you lived where you worked. There was no bedroom climate control. There was just a blanket, hopefully a good one, and perhaps another blanket, if you had one. Winter also created problems for animals. Livestock needed fodder. Hay had to be stored. Grain might be used to supplement animal diets. If fodder ran low, animals could become weak. This created another calculation. How much food should be given to animals? How much should be saved? Which animals are most valuable? A cow producing milk might be kept carefully. An old animal might be slaughtered. A breeding animal was valuable. Again, nothing was simple. The household economy was a web. Then there was clothing. Winter clothing was essential. Wool was especially important in many parts of Europe. But wool clothing took work. Sheep had to be raised. Wool had to be collected, cleaned, carded, spun, woven, finished, then turned into garments. Clothing therefore represented a lot of labor, and if your coat was damaged, you repaired it. You did not casually throw it away. A good cloak could be extremely valuable. Footwear was another issue. Cold, wet feet are unpleasant today. In medieval Europe, they could be more than unpleasant. Walking was necessary. Roads were muddy. Snow could be deep. Leather footwear could become soaked. Keeping feet dry was difficult. So people used whatever solutions were available. Foot coverings, wraps, additional materials, and perhaps simply enduring the discomfort. The medieval peasant was very familiar with discomfort. It was practically a household member. Then there was the possibility of a bad harvest. This is perhaps the most serious kind of bad luck. A single poor year might be manageable. Several poor years could be devastating. Harvest failures could result from weather, crop disease, pests, flooding, drought, war, or combinations of these. When grain supplies shrink, prices can rise. This affects both peasants and urban workers. A peasant might have less grain to sell and might have to buy food at higher prices. This is where food security becomes fragile. The household may begin eating store reserves. Then those reserves disappear. Animals might be sold. Tools might be sold. Land might be leased. Debts might accumulate. And once assets start disappearing, recovery becomes harder. This is why medieval peasants feared bad luck. Not because they were irrational, but because they understood the economics of vulnerability. A small household had little protection. If you had a large reserve, you could survive a bad year. If you had almost nothing, a bad month could be enough. This also explains why charity and religious institutions mattered. Monasteries, churches, and wealthy individuals could sometimes provide food or assistance. The poor could receive alms. Pilgrims could receive hospitality. Religious institutions sometimes stored large quantities of grain. But charity was not a universal safety net. It could help. It could also be limited, and the scale varied greatly. Still, the medieval world had concept of charity and obligation toward the poor. The church taught that helping the needy was a moral duty. This didn't eliminate poverty, but it did create institutions and expectations around assistance. And sometimes that assistance mattered. Then there were natural disasters, floods, storms, fires. A fire was particularly dangerous in villages with wooden structures and thatched roofs. A single accident could damage multiple homes. People had to rebuild, and rebuilding required materials, labor, time, money. A poor household could be pushed into debt. Again, the problem was not simply the disaster itself. It was the aftermath. You lose your roof. Now you need a new roof. You lose grain. Now you need food. You lose tools. Now you need replacements. One event creates several new problems, and medieval peasants were constantly managing these chains of consequences. Yet, somehow, life continued. People repaired, rebuilt, replanted, remarried, raised children, returned to work. This resilience is easy to overlook. We tend to remember disasters because disasters make interesting history. Ordinary recovery does not. Nobody writes a dramatic chronicle saying, "Today, the villagers successfully repaired 3 fences and had a reasonably productive afternoon." But that happened constantly. History survives because ordinary people kept doing ordinary things. They planted again. They rebuilt houses. They replaced tools. They raised new animals. They taught children. They continued. And sometimes they got lucky. A good spring. A warm summer. Enough rain. A healthy herd. A full harvest. The difference between a terrible year and a decent one could be surprisingly small. A little more rain. A little less frost. A little fewer pests. And suddenly the household was breathing more easily. This is why weather was never boring. Modern people look at the weather and complain about being too hot. The medieval peasant looked at the weather and wondered whether the family would eat next winter. Quite a different relationship with clouds. As evening arrives, you return home. The winter sky is already dark. The fire is burning. The house is warmer now. Someone is cooking. The smell of food fills the room. Perhaps the meal is simple, but it is hot, and that matters. You sit close to the hearth. Outside, the cold continues. Inside, the family gathers. Someone tells a story. A child falls asleep. An adult repairs clothing. The fire crackles. For a little while, the problems of the outside world disappear. And perhaps this was one of the great comforts of medieval life. Not comfort in the modern sense. Not luxury, but familiarity. The same house, the same fire, the same people, the same stories, the same seasonal rhythm. A world that was difficult, but understandable. You knew the fields, you knew the animals, you knew the seasons, you knew the village, you knew which road led to the market, you knew where the water came from, you knew who could repair a shoe, who could treat an animal, who could deliver a baby, who had the best bread, who complained too much, and who borrowed your shovel 3 years ago and somehow never returned it. These details made up a life, a very ordinary life. And as the night deepens, the house grows quiet, the children sleep, the fire becomes smaller, the winter wind moves outside, you pull the blanket closer. Tomorrow may be cold, but tomorrow is still tomorrow. For now, the household is together, the food has been eaten, the fire is warm, the roof is holding, the animals are safe, and nothing is required of you for the next few hours. So let the village disappear into the darkness. Let the snow, rain, or cold wind remain outside. Let the hearth glow softly, and let our peasants sleep, because tomorrow there may be sickness, there may be work, there may be taxes, there may be a bad harvest, there may be another problem waiting quietly around the corner, but there may also be bread, a healthy child, a warm fire, a good harvest, a neighbor's help, a market day, a festival, or simply another ordinary morning. And sometimes, in a world as uncertain, ordinary is enough. Sleep now. The winter village is quiet. And for tonight, nothing else needs to happen. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval peasant. By now, we have spent a lot of time talking about work, fields, taxes, food, cold houses, sick animals, broken tools, and the general medieval tradition of making every ordinary task slightly more difficult than it needs to be. But tonight, let's slow down. Because if we only talk about hardship, we miss something important. Medieval peasants were human beings. And human beings have an annoying habit of finding happiness, even when circumstances are not particularly convenient. They fell in love. They married. They had children. They celebrated. They drank. They danced. They told jokes. They went to markets. They attended festivals. They visited neighbors. They argued. They made up. They complained about the weather, and then complained about it again. In other words, they lived. So imagine the village on a warmer morning. The fields are green. The air is softer. The sun rises early. There is work waiting, of course. There is always work. But today feels different. There is something happening in the village. A wedding. And weddings were important events. Marriage was personal, but it was also economic. A marriage could join families, combine property, create new working partnerships, strengthen relationships between households, and produce children who would eventually become part of the community. But none of this means people didn't care about love. They did. Medieval literature is full of love. Courtly romance may focus on nobles, but ordinary people also formed emotional attachments. They had crushes. They flirted. They got jealous. They made terrible romantic decisions. Basically, medieval Europe had discovered the oldest human tradition of all, falling for the wrong person. Imagine meeting someone from a nearby village. Perhaps you see them at the market, perhaps during a festival, perhaps while working. You talk. You see each other again. Eventually, families become involved, because medieval marriage rarely concerned only two individuals. Parents mattered. Property mattered. Work mattered. Reputation mattered. The ability to support a household mattered. You could not simply announce that you were moving out tomorrow with your beloved and expect everything to work itself out. A household needed resources, a place to live, food, tools, clothing, land, or employment, and ideally, enough stability to survive the next winter. So marriage could take time. And then there was the wedding itself. Depending on wealth and local custom, it might be simple or elaborate. A church ceremony could be involved. Families could gather. Food could be prepared. Neighbors might attend. There could be music, dancing, drinking, and a meal that was much better than the average Tuesday dinner. This was important. Feasts gave people a break from ordinary scarcity. A wedding could bring more food into the village. Perhaps meat, better bread, cheese, ale, seasonal foods. People would eat, talk, laugh, and dance. For a few hours, nobody cared that the roof needed repairing. The roof could wait, the wedding could not. And this is one of the reasons festivals mattered. They interrupted the endless rhythm of labor. The medieval calendar was filled with religious celebrations. Christmas, Easter, saints' days, harvest-related customs, local festivals, pilgrimages, markets. Different regions had different traditions, but the basic function was similar. Life could not be work all the time. Even medieval peasants needed breaks. And when a festival arrived, the village changed. People dressed better if they could. Food was prepared. Church bells rang. Visitors arrived. Markets became busier. Music filled public spaces. Children had more freedom to run around. Adults talked. Young people watched one another. And someone inevitably drank more than was wise. Because apparently medieval people had already perfected the art of saying, "I'll just have one," then having considerably more than one. Alcoholic drinks were part of everyday life in many medieval communities. Ale, beer, wine, and other beverages varied by region and period. Not everyone drank constantly. That stereotype is exaggerated. But communal drinking was important in many social settings. And drinking could be part of hospitality. A guest might be offered a drink. A wedding might include ale. A festival could involve alcohol. A successful harvest could be celebrated. The drink itself was not necessarily the main event. The social gathering was. People wanted to be together, and that matters, because medieval life could be physically demanding. Community provided emotional relief. You knew the people around you. You worked beside them. You traded with them. You borrowed things from them. You celebrated with them. You mourned with them. And when someone died, the whole community might be affected. Death was much more visible in medieval society. People died at home. Families cared for sick relatives. Funerals were community events. Religious rituals surrounded death. Children saw aging and death as part of ordinary life. This doesn't mean medieval people were emotionless. Quite the opposite. They grieved. They mourned. They remembered. They created memorials. They prayed for the dead. They told stories about people who had passed away. But death was woven into the rhythm of life. And that made celebrations even more meaningful. A festival was a reminder that life continued. The harvest was successful. The child was healthy. The marriage had happened. The community was still together. There was food. There was music. For a little while, things were good. Let's float over to the market. The market town is one of the most exciting places in the medieval peasant's world. Not exciting in the modern theme park sense, but exciting because it is different. There are more people, more sounds, more smells, more goods, more information. You walk through stalls. Someone is selling cloth. Another person has pottery. A blacksmith displays tools. A butcher has meat. A baker has bread. A merchant has things from farther away. Maybe spices. Maybe salt. Maybe imported fabric. Maybe something you have never seen before. And suddenly the wider world feels close. Markets also provide entertainment. People talk, watch performers, listen to stories, meet friends, see relatives, and gossip. Always gossip. A market is basically medieval social media. Except instead of scrolling, you have to physically walk past the person delivering the information. And there is no comment section. Just your neighbor standing next to you saying, "Did you hear?" Of course you heard. Everyone heard. Markets also allowed peasants to sell their surplus. Eggs, cheese, animals, grain, cloth, craft goods, and that money could matter. Perhaps you save for a new pair of shoes. Maybe you need a tool. Maybe you want better clothing. Perhaps you are preparing for a marriage or paying a tax. The market therefore connects personal life to the broader economy. And then there are children. Children probably experience festivals differently. For them, the medieval village was an enormous playground. A pile of wood could become a fort. A stick could become a sword. A field could become a kingdom. A dog could become a horse, apparently. Children invented games. They raced, played with simple toys, told stories, and imitated adults. Some toys were surprisingly sophisticated. Small dolls, balls, wooden animals, spinning objects, simple games. The absence of modern toys did not mean the absence of imagination. Children don't require batteries. They require something to do, and they were very good at finding things to do. Of course, adults eventually reminded them that they also had chores, because medieval childhood was not entirely free. Children helped. They carried things, collected fuel, watched animals, helped with food preparation, worked in fields, learned crafts. But there were still moments when they were simply children. A village festival could be one of those moments. And perhaps that is why festivals remain so important across centuries. They created memories. A child might remember a particular feast, a wedding, a procession, a fair, a market, a musician, a special meal, a funny incident. Those memories could become part of family stories. And family stories were one of the ways ordinary people preserved their sense of identity. There were no family photo albums, no video recordings, no social media posts. But there were stories. My grandfather owned that field. Your grandmother met your grandfather at the fair. Your uncle fell into the stream during the festival. And everyone would laugh. Maybe the story wasn't even true anymore, but it survived because people remembered. Now let's return to the house. The festival has ended. The village becomes quiet again. Tomorrow there will be work. The fields still need attention. The animals still need feeding. The taxes still exist. The Lord is still the Lord. The church still expects its obligations. Nothing has fundamentally changed. And yet, something has. You have memories. You have relationships. You have people around you. That is the part of medieval life that is easiest to forget when we focus only on hardship. A poor household could still have affection. A hard-working farmer could still love his children. A woman carrying water could still laugh with her friends. A shepherd could still enjoy a beautiful sunset. A child could still find a stick and decide it was the greatest sword in Europe. A couple could still fall in love. And a family could still sit around a fire and feel safe. These moments mattered, maybe precisely because they were small. The medieval peasant didn't need a luxury vacation to feel happy. A good meal could be enough. A warm room, a successful harvest, a healthy baby, a repaired roof, a festival, a friend, a quiet evening, small victories. And perhaps this is a lesson hidden inside the miserable life of the medieval peasant. Life was difficult, but difficult does not mean empty. People adapted. They built communities. They developed traditions. They found humor. They created meaning. They loved, and they hoped, even when the future was uncertain, even when winter was coming, even when food stores were low, even when taxes were due. Hope remained, because the human mind is remarkably stubborn. Give it a difficult world, and it still looks for tomorrow. And now, as evening settles over the village, imagine one final scene. The festival is over. The roads are empty. The market stalls are gone. The animals are quiet. The last visitors have gone home. Inside the little house, the family sits near the fire. Someone is tired. Someone is smiling. A child is asleep. The adults speak quietly. There is very little light, just a warm glow from the hearth. Outside, the fields stretch into the darkness. Tomorrow they will need attention again, but tonight they can wait. You lie down. The straw mattress is still uncomfortable. Obviously, we have not yet invented modern bedding, but you are tired, very tired. You close your eyes. The fire crackles. The wind moves outside. Someone shifts in their sleep, and slowly, the village disappears into darkness. Tomorrow there will be another morning, another day of work, another meal, another problem, another small pleasure, another reason to keep going. But tonight, there is nothing to solve, nothing to harvest, nothing to pay, nothing to repair, just sleep. And somewhere in a quiet village, a medieval peasant dreams, not of becoming a king, not of owning a castle, perhaps simply of a good harvest, a warm house, healthy children, enough food, and maybe, if the gods are feeling generous, a day tomorrow when nothing goes wrong. For a medieval peasant, that might be the perfect dream. And honestly, it still sounds pretty good. Hey guys, tonight we reached the final part of our slow journey through the miserable life of a medieval peasant. So dim the lights, get comfortable, let the room become quiet. There is nowhere else you need to be. No field waiting for you. No bucket of water. No landlord asking about rent. And, thankfully, no rooster standing outside your window with a personal mission to destroy your sleep. For the last time, let's return to that little medieval village. The night is almost over. The fire is burned down. The house is quiet. A family is sleeping. Outside, the fields are covered in darkness. The road is empty. And somewhere beyond the village, the first light of morning is beginning to appear. Soon, another day will begin. And for our peasant, it will probably look very much like the day before. That is the strange thing about ordinary history. It repeats. The great kings may change. Borders may move. Castles may be built. Wars may begin and end. But the person living in a little house outside the center of power still has to wake up tomorrow morning. The same fields remain. The same animals need feeding. The same roof needs watching. The same bread needs making. And the same collection of problems is waiting patiently for everyone to become conscious. You open your eyes. The room is still dark. For a moment, you don't move. You listen. There's a sound of breathing. A child turns over. Someone coughs softly. The fire gives a faint crackle. And then, from somewhere outside, the rooster. Of course, he has returned. After all these centuries, some traditions are apparently impossible to eliminate. You sit up, your feet touch the cold floor. You pull on your clothing, and you begin another day. But now, after everything we've seen, the scene feels a little different. At the beginning of our journey, the peasant might have seemed like a symbol of misery. A poor person living in a dark little house, working endlessly, paying taxes, eating simple food, sleeping on straw, waiting for winter, waiting for harvest, waiting for something to go wrong. And yes, there was plenty of hardship. But that isn't the whole story. Because the medieval peasant was not simply a victim of history. He was also a participant in it. So was she. So were their children. These people made decisions. They chose crops. They managed animals. They repaired tools. They negotiated marriages. They traded in markets. They argued over land. They attended churches. They celebrated festivals. They helped neighbors. They raised children. They remembered their dead. And they tried to make the next year slightly better than the last. That is a very human story. And perhaps one of the most important things to understand about medieval peasants is that they were not living in a permanent state of despair. We often imagine the Middle Ages through the extremes. Plague, war, famine, castles, executions, kings. But most days were much less dramatic. Most days were simply ordinary. A farmer worked. A mother prepared food. A child played. A craftsman repaired something. A shepherd watched sheep. A merchant traveled. A priest conducted a service. A family ate dinner. And then everyone went to sleep. Again, and again, and again. That repetition created a life. A life that could last decades. If you were fortunate enough to survive childhood and avoid serious disease or injury, you might spend many years in the same village. You could know the landscape almost perfectly. You would know where the soil was good, where water collected after rain, which path became muddy, which tree provided shade, which field belonged to which family, which neighbor was trustworthy, which neighbor was not. You would know the seasons, the first signs of spring, the arrival of summer, the beginning of harvest, the first cold mornings, the approach of winter. Your world was smaller than ours, but within that world, your knowledge could be extraordinary. You might know dozens of plants. You might know how to judge a sheep's health. You might know how to repair a plow. You might know how to preserve meat. You might know how to spin wool. You might know which herbs were useful. You might know exactly how much grain your household needed. Modern people sometimes describe medieval peasants as uneducated, but that can be misleading. Many could not read or write. But literacy is only one form of knowledge. A farmer who cannot read a book can still understand soil. A woman who cannot write a medical text can still know how to care for a child. A craftsman can understand materials through years of experience. A shepherd can recognize an unhealthy animal before anyone else notices. Knowledge existed everywhere. It simply wasn't always written down. And some of that knowledge was passed through generations. A father teaches a son. A mother teaches a daughter. A craftsperson teaches an apprentice. An older neighbor explains a local custom. The village becomes a kind of living library. And every generation adds something. Sometimes it loses something. Sometimes it learns something new. Sometimes it stubbornly continues doing something simply, because that's how it has always been done. Again, very human. Let's think about the house one more time. The walls are simple. The floor may be earth. The roof may be thatch. The furniture is limited. The lighting is dim. The air may smell strongly of smoke. And yet, this is home. That word matters. Home is not determined by luxury. Home is familiarity. The same fire. The same people. The same sounds. The same objects. The same corner where someone always sits. The same place where the children sleep. The same doorway through which everyone enters. A wealthy medieval lord had a grander home, but the peasant still had a home. And inside that home, there could be laughter. There could be affection. There could be arguments. There could be celebrations. There could be grief. There could be stories. There could be silence. There could be sleep. That is what makes the history of ordinary people so important. They left fewer written records, but they experienced life just as deeply. A peasant could fall in love with someone. They could miss a parent who died. They could worry about a sick child. They could feel proud when the harvest was good. They could be annoyed when a neighbor crossed a boundary. They could laugh at a ridiculous story. They could look at the first snow of winter and think, here we go again. They could hope. They could fear. They could dream. And they could be happy. Perhaps not constantly. Nobody is, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough. Now imagine harvest. The fields are golden. The village is busy. People are working together. Grain is being gathered. Animals move between buildings. Children carry smaller loads. Adults work quickly. Everyone knows the importance of the moment. The harvest is not just food. It is security. It is the future. A good harvest means the winter might be easier. A poor harvest means another year of uncertainty. So the village works. And eventually, the grain is stored. The barns fill. The household looks at its supplies. There is relief. Maybe not celebration. Not yet, but relief. Another year has been completed. The cycle continues. This is one of the most important rhythms of medieval life. Birth, growth, harvest, winter, spring, birth again, death, marriage, work, rest, and then another year. People lived according to cycles. The church calendar, the agricultural calendar, the seasons, the stages of life. Time was not simply a straight line leading toward the future. It was something that repeated. The same festivals returned. The same agricultural tasks returned. The same seasons returned. And because of that, life could feel predictable. Not safe, but predictable. You knew winter would come. You knew spring would follow. You knew the fields would need planting. You knew harvest would arrive. The great uncertainty was how well each cycle would go. And sometimes things went well. This is worth remembering. There were medieval villages that prospered. There were peasants who accumulated land. There were farmers who became relatively comfortable. Some ordinary rural families owned several animals. Some had good houses. Some employed workers. Some became merchants. Some moved into towns. The word peasant does not automatically mean destitute. There were differences in wealth within rural society. Some people had much more than others. Some had almost nothing. Social mobility existed, although it was limited and varied. Life was not completely frozen. People moved, married, inherited, bought, sold, borrowed, traveled, changed occupations. The medieval world was more dynamic than the stereotype suggests. And yet, for many, The basic reality remained hard: physical labor, limited resources, disease, uncertain harvests, obligations, environmental risks. That is why the word miserable isn't entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Miserable describes some parts of the experience. It does not describe the whole human being. A person can have a difficult life and still love it. A family can be poor and still be close. A village can be harsh and still feel like home. A farmer can complain about the harvest and still feel proud when the grain comes in. Humans are remarkably good at adapting to their circumstances. We become accustomed to things. We build routines. We create meaning. We find small pleasures. And the medieval peasant was no different. Perhaps the best meal wasn't every day. Maybe it was once a week. Maybe at a festival. Maybe after a successful harvest. But when it came, it mattered. A warm bowl of food, fresh bread, cheese, a little meat, a drink, family nearby. That could be a very good evening. A medieval child didn't need a room full of toys. A stick could become a sword. A piece of wood could become a cart. A field could become an adventure. A festival could feel enormous. A market could feel exciting. A traveling musician could be memorable for years. And a story told by a grandparent could survive for generations. Life was smaller, but small things could become large in memory. Let's imagine one final evening. The sun is setting. The day's work is done. The animals are fed. The tools have been put away. The fields are quiet. Smoke rises from the houses. Inside your home, dinner is being prepared. You sit near the hearth. Someone talks about the weather. Someone talks about the market. Someone mentions a neighbor. Someone laughs. A child falls asleep before dinner is finished. The fire glows. Outside, darkness arrives. And for a moment, everything is exactly as it should be. No king is coming. No great battle is happening. No historical monument is being built. Nothing important, according to textbooks, is happening. And yet, this is history. This quiet evening. This family. This meal. This fire. These people. They are the reason history happened at all. Kings could not rule without farmers. Castles could not function without food. Cities could not survive without rural production. Armies could not march without supplies. Churches could not operate without communities. The great medieval world rested on millions of ordinary people doing ordinary work. Most of them never became famous. Most left no portraits, no famous letters, no biographies, no grand monuments. But they lived, and that is enough. Eventually, the night deepens. The family goes to sleep. The fire becomes a few glowing embers. The village becomes quiet. The fields disappear into darkness. And our peasant lies down. The mattress is still made of straw. The room is still cold. Tomorrow there will still be work. The taxes have not disappeared. The Lord is still there. The weather is still unpredictable. The animals will still need feeding. The roof may still leak. Life has not magically become easier, but something has changed. We now understand a person lying there, not as a cartoon peasant, not as a miserable figure standing in a muddy field, but as a human being, someone who worked, someone who worried, someone who loved, someone who hoped, someone who occasionally got lucky, someone who sometimes had a very bad day, someone who enjoyed a good meal, someone who laughed at something stupid, someone who probably complained about the weather, someone who wanted tomorrow to be a little better. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember medieval peasants, not as people who were miserable every day, and not as romantic villagers living a peaceful rustic dream, but as people living complicated lives in a difficult world. They had less. They worked more. They had fewer choices. They faced dangers we rarely think about. But they also had family, community, tradition, faith, friendship, food, celebrations, and moments of genuine happiness. Their world was hard, but it was still a world. And inside that world, people built lives, slowly, quietly, one day at a time. The fire is almost gone now. The house is dark. The village is sleeping. The fields are waiting for morning. And once again, the cycle is about to begin. Soon the sky will brighten. The rooster will wake up Someone will stir the fire. Someone will carry water. Someone will feed the animals. Someone will walk toward the fields. And another ordinary day will begin, but you don't have to follow them anymore. You can stay here, in the quiet. The village is far away now. The fields are silent. The fire is only a faint glow. The medieval road is empty. No one is asking you to work. No one is asking you to harvest. No one is asking you to pay. There is nothing left to calculate. Nothing left to repair. Nothing left to carry. Just darkness and sleep. So let the little village fade into the distance. Let the fields disappear. Let the sound of the animals become softer. Let the fire become a tiny point of light. And remember the ordinary people who lived there. They woke with the sunrise. They worked. They ate. They loved. They worried. They celebrated. They lost people. They raised children. They grew old. And eventually, they became part of the soil they had spent their lives working. Their names are mostly forgotten. But their lives are not meaningless. They built the roads. They grew the grain. They raised the animals. They made the clothes. They repaired the tools. They carried the water. They filled the markets. They kept the villages alive. And in doing so, they quietly supported the entire medieval world. So tonight, when you turn off your own light and settle into your much more comfortable bed, perhaps spare one small thought for the person who went to sleep 1,000 years ago on a pile of straw. Their life was harder. Their world was smaller. Their future was less certain. But they still closed their eyes at night, hoping for tomorrow. And now, finally, tomorrow can wait. The fields can wait. The animals can wait. The taxes can wait. The rooster can wait, although he probably won't. The village is quiet. The fire is low. The night is deep. And somewhere in the darkness, another morning is slowly approaching. But for now, sleep,